Welcome to Shekhar Gupta, Dr. Yamini Aiyar, Pradeep Chibber, and all of you. For those of you who knew us, it's fine. For those who don't, basically we provide a platform for research into contemporary and modern India. So people, our own fellows, of course, after the selection process is over, we don't bother about them, as long as they work in modern India. And therefore, when anybody anywhere in the world wants to study it, they also come here because of the fantastic archives built over the last 50, 60 years. The personal papers, the journals, microfilms, etc. And therefore, when Pradeep asked me that he wants to do this event here, I said, most welcome. This is possibly the first time that undergrads will be speaking at this place since it was set up 54 years ago. So my congratulations to those who are going to speak. We are going to enjoy listening to you. Let me not more time. And before that, please put your phones on silent mode. In case you have friends outside who can't make it, we are live on Facebook Live and our own website, nehrumemorial.nic.in. So please transmit to them so they can watch it from wherever they are in the world. Pradeep, over to you.
Thanks. At the University of California at Berkeley, where I also hold the Indo-American Community Chair in India Studies and am the Director of the Institute of International Studies and some other odd titles. Okay. But I'd like to thank Shakti Sinha for organizing this event and to Shekhar Gupta and Yamini Aiyar for being discussants. What is the genesis of this program? 4 years ago, several undergraduate students at UC Berkeley approached me to teach a class where they could carry out original research in and about India using modern data analytics. They wanted to gain hands-on experience in using big data or applying new experimental methods to understand the politics, economics, and social issues related to contemporary India. I thought this was a great idea, and donors in this room and in India helped us establish the Berkeley Research on Contemporary India program. The program consists of a formal course where students are taught data analytic research on India in a seminar setting. Each of the students you will hear from today has picked a topic they want to work on, and that's really important. Students have to be motivated to do research on what they want to do research on. The students then receive individual support from 2 graduate students to develop their formal research and programming skills, especially learning R and statistical methods. So every single presentation today will be based on data as they delve into their projects. And I believe that there is no better way of learning than doing. Not only do you understand your data, not only do you understand your project, but you also learn both the strengths as well as the limitations of your research. And each of the students who is speaking here today is deeply aware of both the strengths and the weaknesses of their findings. The support of donors makes it possible for me to add graduate student instructors to the course, to provide some travel funding to the undergraduates who need to collect data, and to support student access to specialized data sets. Thanks to the generosity of people here, close to 30 students have participated in the program with some spectacular results. Yunru Phua is a former political science student, who took this class, he's been hired by Google to run the fraud division. Anti-fraud division, right? Quiet. Aditya Chaturvedi, a computer science graduate, now at Palantir, speaks volubly about the skills he learned in the class that have helped him professionally as a computer scientist. And there have been some other people who've been associated with it. And I have to do this. Sorry, Matt. Matt Baxter here, who teaches at Ashoka University, and I will say this without any shame, is the world's leading expert, interpreter, and translator of Periyar anywhere. So if you have any questions about Periyar, you should go see Matt Baxter. Also a Berkeley PhD. You'll see that the students this year have done very well. The students who are presenting this year, some of their work has already appeared in the Indian media. 2 projects have been picked up by the Indian media. One on the impact of Twitter posts on political careers. Some of you may be familiar with it. And the other on predicting national election results from state assembly results. There are other surprising findings that you will hear today. but I will let the students and their research speak for themselves. Before I turn it over, I would like to thank those of you who have supported our program in the past. We could not do this without you. If you wish to contribute to our program in any way, please see Rexa Louis, the Administrative Director at the Institute, who's here with us. Please share your email with us so we can be in touch. And if you're an incoming Cal student, and there are quite a few of them here, welcome. Welcome to Berkeley. Go Bears, as we would say. And feel free to pick the brains of any of the current students or come and see me and ask questions. And please stay in touch. And now you will not hear from me again.
So hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Professor Chibber, for that introduction. My name is Janani Mohan, and for my research presentation, I was really interested in breaking the Indian news down. So to do this, I decided to look at the impact of media bias on attitudes in India. Wrong direction? Okay. So my research question asks, does Indian media bias affect attitudes? And this question is super exciting right now, especially in the context of the recent elections, because what we've seen is we've seen so many people and politicians talking about how Indian media bias is affecting voter attitudes. So what I wanted to look at is I wanted to see whether that relationship is actually true. And my finding is kind of surprising. Instead of seeing a really strong relationship between media bias and attitudes, which is maybe what we believe based on all of the rhetoric, we see the exact opposite. There's only a limited association between the two. So for my research, what I'm looking at in particular is newspaper and TV channel bias, and I'm using data from the Lognity Youth Survey. And what's really relevant about this survey is that it focuses on people between ages 18 and 35. And presumably with this age group, our viewpoints are not yet fully formed, so maybe like media bias will be impacting us more. So why is my research question interesting? Well, globally what we see is that media exposure of traditional news sources like newspapers and TV are decreasing. However, in India, exposure is actually increasing. So as shown in the graph, since 1996, watching TV news and reading newspapers has actually been on the rise in India. And this relationship holds true when looking at youth in particular. So based on the youth survey data and looking at daily and weekly consumers of news, what I found is that 44% of youth are getting their news from TV, 41% from newspapers, as opposed to only 15% from online. And this heavy preference for TV and newspapers holds true across various demographic groups among youth. So after looking at why my question is interesting, what I wanted to do next is I wanted to figure out some sort of way to determine how media bias in India is affecting attitudes. So to do this, what I had to do is I had to figure out a way to define media bias first. And the problem with this is that media bias ratings are actually unavailable for most Indian outlets. So what I first had to do is I had to code popular newspapers and TV channels among youth on an ideological scale from liberal -1 to conservative 1. This involved two steps, one for newspapers and one for TV. So first, with regards to newspaper bias, I looked at a total of 30 newspapers, and I searched those newspapers for editorial pieces over a 2-year period from 2017 to 2018 for a defined set of social issues. And these social issues included gender issues, caste issues, and religious issues. The full list of them are here. In total, I ended up reading 550 newspaper editorial articles across 11 languages, so like Hindi, Punjabi, English, Marathi, Gujarati, Urdu, etc. And after reading the individual articles, I coded the articles as liberal -1, 0 neutral, or 1 conservative, based on what the articles were arguing. So for instance, if an editorial piece on the Sabrimala temple dispute was arguing that women should definitely be allowed access into the temple, I'd code that as liberal or -1. And if it was arguing that women should definitely not be allowed into the temple, I would code that as conservative or 1. And then after coding the individual editorials, what I did next is I averaged the editorial score by topic to find the ideological score for each newspaper. And the reason I did this by topic is because let's say there were only 2 articles on the Sabrimala temple dispute and 20 on Uniform Civil Code, I wanted to balance that off in my ideological rating of each newspaper. So what this looked like in practice is I had this very giant Excel spreadsheet. a list of all the newspapers, a list of articles under each newspaper, like editorial pieces that were on the relevant topics, individual ideological scores for each article, and then the averaged ideological score overall for the newspaper. In addition, I had a bunch of search terms I was using to pull up relevant editorial pieces, and I translated those search terms across all of the languages that the newspapers were in. So these were my final ratings that I came up with, and what's important to note here is that these ratings are what we'd expect to see for these newspapers. So, for example, the most liberal newspaper on the scale is Prajavani, which is a local Kannada newspaper, and the most conservative newspaper on the scale is Dainik Jagran over there, which is a Hindi national newspaper. Okay, I'm seeing that's getting some sort of reaction. But this is what we'd expect then, since clearly some of the audience agrees on this. So, and then in addition to newspapers, I also looked at TV bias, which I'll put up these findings in a second too. But for TV channels, it was a little bit more straightforward. I looked at a total of 41 TV channels, and I coded those channels based on their owners' or managers' ties to Indian political parties. So for example, ZTV is owned by Subhash Chandra, who's an MP backed by the BJP. So I coded ZTV as 1 or conservative. And my final ratings for this are as follows, and just a quick note here is that these ratings are, again, typically what we'd expect to see for these TV channels. So after coming up with those media ideological ratings, what I next had to do is I had to figure out a way to tie that back into my research question, which, if just as a quick reminder, has to do with attitudes in India. So to do this, I looked back at that Lotniti Youth Survey, and I looked at questions that were asking youth about social attitudes, economic attitudes, and security-related attitudes. And my findings were twofold. So first, with regards to social attitudes, I found that only newspaper bias, not TV bias, is significantly associated with social attitudes in India. So, for example, the survey asks the following question. Are the following relationships right or wrong? And these can be relationships between different castes, different religions, and people living together before marriage. And what this graph in particular is showing is it's showing the difference in the average newspaper and TV ideological ratings of people who answered right versus people who answered wrong to the question. And of course, a quick note about this graph is that the relationship that we saw here was as expected. People who were reading more liberal news sources and TV channels were more likely to answer right to the question. However, what we find here is that only the blue differences, so only the differences for newspaper channels have a significant correlation. So we can see that the differences for newspaper channels here in blue are much larger than the ones in green for TV, and that kind of hints at how newspapers just have like a much larger significant correlation with social attitudes, whereas TV bias is not having a significant correlation at all. Now, in addition to social attitudes, I also looked at economic and security attitudes. And my finding here was actually that neither newspapers nor TV biases are significantly associated with economic and security attitudes. So, for example, the survey asks, how much do you worry about the following things? And these can be social issues like tradition and family, economic issues like jobs and studies, and security-related issues like riots and terrorism. And once again, this graph is showing the difference in the average ratings of the newspaper and TV consumed by people who answered yes versus those who answered no to the question. And also, a quick note here is that the relationship was as expected. People who were consuming more conservative media were more likely to answer that they were worrying about these different factors. And what my final finding here is that neither newspapers nor TV biases have a significant association with economic or security-related attitudes. In fact, for this question, the only significant association that I found was between newspaper bias and the social issues, as pointed to in my first finding. So what we're seeing here really is that no media bias is having an effect on economic or security attitudes in India. So after coming up with these two findings, what I next wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that my findings hold across various demographic groups. So to do this, I looked at various caste groups, income, gender, religion, age, and urban among youth. And what I found is that across almost all of these groups, across almost all of the questions, my findings were holding, which is just very fascinating because we'd expect to see the opposite, but instead we're seeing this very limited association between media bias and attitudes. And in addition to this, I also wanted to make sure that the relationships that like the relationship between newspaper bias and social attitudes was actually statistically significant. So to do this, I ran a multivariate regression analysis. And what I mean by this is I looked at whether newspaper bias ratings were affecting social attitudes while controlling for the TV bias rating of the TV consumed by an individual, their gender, and their income. And what I found consistently is that the only statistically significant result was between newspaper bias and social attitudes. No other media bias was having an effect on any other attitude at all. So, as shown by my analysis, my findings almost always held true. In conclusion, I want to return back to my research question. So my question asked, does media bias in India affect attitudes? And the answer is unexpected. We'd expect to see that there's this large effect based on the rhetoric we see in the news about how media bias might have a large effect on voters. But instead what we're actually seeing is that media bias in India only has a limited association with attitudes. Newspaper bias only has an association with social attitudes, and TV bias has no association with any attitudes at all, which is just really interesting. Because, I mean, we pretty much expect to see the opposite here. So while my research, of course, is focusing on correlation, not a causative relationship, it does point at an underlying causative relationship here, which is that perhaps only newspaper bias may be impacting only social attitudes, because this is the only place where we are actually seeing a significant correlation at all. So, of course, this is a very interesting conclusion, because it's not what I expected or what any of us in the room seem to have expected either. But in the future, what I hope to do is I hope to continue using my ideological rating score to study more about voter attitudes in India, both expanding on political and continuing to look at these attitudes, because clearly what we assume to be the case in India might not actually be what's going on. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So my name is Sophie, and I'm a fourth-year student in political economy, and my research thinks about if access to state-sponsored credit can increase confidence in state institutions. So in my presentation today, I will first talk you through my introduction and argument, and then I will go into my methodology and results, and then finally leave you all with some further considerations. So the Indian Human Development Survey is a comprehensive, long-form survey that was administered to about 42,000 households all across India in 2011-2012. And what this survey finds, which I don't think is surprising to most of us in the room, is that confidence in institutions is a pervasive issue in India, especially for poor individuals. So on this bar graph here, I pulled out 4 institutions that I thought would be the most impactful to poor individuals on a day-to-day basis. So I looked at the police, state government, politicians, and the local government. And what I found is that for poor individuals, about 20 to 50% of them say that they have, in the rural and urban, across rural and urban, say that they have no confidence at all in those institutions. And while this lack of confidence is often grounded in real experiences of corruption or ineffectiveness, the problem is that it further exacerbates poverty by encouraging them to disengage with the state and not get the resources that they need or qualify for. However, there's a body of research in political science that finds that across structurally similar socioeconomic conditions, citizens can actually vary in their engagement with the state. That this relative difference is largely the product of the visibility and accessibility of the welfare state. So in other words, if in an individual's local environment there's a strong presence of the state or welfare, they're more likely to understand the state and ask things of it and engage with it. However, we know that in the Indian case, the process of dispersing this welfare is often violated and more characterized by corruption or arbitrariness, which probably isn't going to help the confidence that we're trying to increase. So what I want to think about is, are there more effective ways to increase confidence? So I argue that state-sponsored credit, so formal credit, can increase confidence in state institutions by first increasing the visibility of the state in the local environment, like welfare, but second, more effectively establishing a reliable process between a state actor and a citizen and fostering trust. In order to think about this question, the first thing I did was define poverty by classifying asset ownership in the rural and urban context, and then splitting my respondents into the rural and urban populations, because we know that in the Indian case, poverty and access of government looks very different in the rural and urban context. So first, for my independent variable. So in the Indian case, and in a lot of cases, if you want credit, you have two options. The first is accessing it through a formal loan through the bank, and the second is accessing it through the informal, which we know will probably lead to much higher interest rates and much lower reliability in terms of paying back your loan and your interaction. So I defined informal as family and friends, employers and money lenders, and formal as banks and microfinance institutions. And again, I focused on the process of accessing that credit, not how much credit or over how much time they paid it back. And then for my dependent variable, like I showed you in my first slide, I looked at the likelihood of poor individuals who have accessed either formal or informal credit to say that they had no confidence in the state at all. And once I'd established my independent and dependent variable, I conducted a multivariate analysis to compare different levels of confidence with different levels of formal or informal loans. So now I will go into my results. And so first, I'll look at my results for the rural and urban poor population. So as you can see on this graph, on the x-axis, I have the likelihood of individuals to say, again, that they have no confidence in the state. On the y-axis. And on the x-axis, I look at individuals who have accessed no formal or informal loans and compare that with individuals who have accessed the maximum amount of informal or informal loans. And what you can see is that the more individuals access informal loans, the less likely they are to say that they have no confidence in the state at all. And the more they access informal loans, the more likely they are to say that they have no confidence. So what I'm comparing is this gap to here. And the more, yeah. And so for my rural poor, I found that this trend held across all four institutions I looked at. So the local government, politicians, state, and the police. And then when I looked at the urban poor, I found the same trend across all four institutions of government. So again, the more they accessed formal credit, the less likely they were to say that they had no confidence in the state at all. But then it's possible to think that these results are just the result of other interactions or relationships these individuals might have with the state. So I wanted to look at other government mechanisms. So first, I looked at individuals who were recipients of government schemes like Annapurna or state-sponsored insurance. And while my results did vary a little bit more, I again found the same trend. So the more they accessed formal state loans, the less likely they were to say that they were not confident in the state, and the more they accessed informal loans, the opposite effect happened in that their likelihood to say that they were not confident increased. So again, comparing this gap and this gap. And this held for rural and urban poor populations and across all four institutions. And then I looked at individuals who already had some sort of personal relationship with a state actor. So that could be a local bureaucrat, a politician, or a government official. And while my results, again, varied a little bit more than in the first population, I found the same trend across all four of the same institutions and across the rural and urban poor, showing an independent effect of accessing formal credit and loans through banks. So in conclusion, the more channels poor individuals have to access formal state credit, the less likely they are to say that they have no confidence in the state. This is an independent effect across the rural-urban divide, individuals who receive other forms of government schemes and insurance, and individuals who are connected with government actors. This means that the process of setting up an accessing credit and then paying back the credit and building that relationship with a state actor can foster confidence and engagement with the state for poor individuals. So in terms of further considerations, I wanted to just note that my research does not find an issue with welfare itself, but instead the process of dispersing welfare. That if anything, my findings support an exciting opportunity to strengthen the disbursement process of welfare and what that could do for fostering engagement with poor individuals who really need to have a relationship with the state to get the resources that they need and qualify for. Thank you.
I'd just like to keep a reminder while the students are going that all this work has been done in one semester. So for those of you who are coming in, this is 3.5 months of work.
Hi, my name is Ariman Kataruka, and I'm going to be talking about the medium of instruction in schools and the impact they have on politics. So as you can see from this graph, Hindi is the dominant medium of instruction in lower levels of education. And in higher levels of education, it's English. In fact, English has grown to such an extent that between 2003 and 2011, the number of students attending English medium schools grew by 274% to over 20 million Indians. So does that signify the decline of regional languages? Research suggests that it does not. A study conducted by Google and KPMG states that by 2021, over 536 million Indians are expected to access the internet using regional languages. So are there any differences in learning outcomes between regional languages and Hindi or English? While there are no significant differences in learning outcomes, with globalization in context, English medium students are more likely to perform marginally better in mathematics and in pure sciences. What is the significance of regional languages? Regional languages are key to one's sense of regional identity and are absolutely imperative in identifying commonalities between a group of people. So for my study, my central research question is, do regional languages as the medium of instruction in schools impact democratic institutions? My independent variables are the medium of instruction and the type of schooling received by a student, and my dependent variables are various measures of political participation and faith displayed in state institutions. I hypothesize that people studying in schools where the medium of instruction is a regional language are more likely to display increased faith in government institutions. These people are also likely to go out and vote more actively and participate in politics more actively. For this research, I have used the Indian Human Development Survey and the Youth Survey. I considered all 29 states of India and analyzed over 45,000 observations. I compared my observations based on their medium of instruction and the type of schooling they were reported to have received. I measured the impact these variables had on their regional identity, their likelihood of participating in processions and rallies, their likelihood of going out and campaigning, their sense of state identity, faith in various government institutions like panchayats, the state government, the police, schools and hospitals, and lastly, voting patterns of these people. So this graph displays the impact the type of schooling has on identities and political participation. This is the type of schooling is directly relevant to my research question because of the people who had said to have attended public schools, over 75% of them reported to have spoken a regional language at home. As you can see, the likelihood of participating in processions and rallies increases from 14 to 22%. The likelihood of campaigning almost doubles, and the likelihood of going out and actively voting increases from 55 to 66%, thereby displaying a holistic increase in one's likelihood of participating in politics if they were educated in a regional language. The next graph shows the direct impact one's medium of instruction has on their faith in state institutions. As you can see, people whose medium of instruction was a regional language were more likely to display increased faith in the police, state government, panchayats, and state schools and hospitals. Faith in the police increased from 21 to 30%. Faith in the state government was said to increase from 23 to 31%. Faith in panchayats increased from 26 to 31%, and faith in state schools and hospitals increased from 58 to 65%. Once again, displaying an over-the-board increase in state institutions. I believe that this increase faith in state institutions as well as political participation stems from an increased emphasis placed on regional identities. People whose medium of instruction was a regional language were more likely to value their village identity and state identity over other identities such as their religious identity, their national identity, or their caste identity. I believe that identity plays a large role because once people can identify with the people who are representing them, they're more actively likely to participate in their selection. One may argue that factors other than the ones I've just discussed may have impacted my findings. To do this, I compared these variables for different levels of income and education, and my results were largely consistent across various levels, except for the highest income bracket where people were marginally less likely to display increased faith in state institutions and participate politically. So in conclusion, my research provides evidence against the current trend seen in India wherein the number of English medium schools are increasing rapidly. I found that people whose medium of instruction was a regional language were more likely to display increased political participation as well as faith in state institutions. I argue that these effects are a result of increased emphasis given to regional identities of a person. Areas of further research include researching to what extent does the use of a regional language as the medium of instruction impact the rise of regional parties in India. Regional parties, as we all know, have seen steady rise over the last 2 decades, and as of Thursday, 14 out of the 29 Indian states were actually controlled by regional parties. Another area of further research includes finding theories that explain the significance of regional languages, such as in-group favoritism, sub-nationalism, or regionalism. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sanika, and I'm studying neurobiology at Berkeley, and I'm going to talk to you about something a little different from the other presenters today. For the past year and a half, I've been working on a cognitive psychology study looking at how to improve education for deaf students, specifically by looking at creativity and academic performance. So in this world, there are about 1 billion people that live with disabilities. And students with disabilities are still underrepresented in institutions of higher learning. In India, these students face additional obstacles. This includes non-holistic evaluations, a lack of resources, and social stigma. As a country with one of the largest populations in the world, these students also face fierce academic competition, and often, on top of all of this, a poverty barrier. So, what is creativity, and how can we use it to enhance the academic experience for students that are deaf? I used a definition by E. Paul Torrance, a renowned creativity psychologist. And according to E. Paul Torrance, creative thinking is the process of creating and testing solutions to problems. And according to Torrance, this process ultimately involves communicating the results. So this point will become very important in my discussion of creativity in regards to deaf students. As we know, deaf students have a hard time developing their language skills orally, so communication is key in terms of discussing their creativity. So as I've kind of gotten into already, I wanted to study creativity, academic performance, and psychological well-being to improve education for deaf students. And to do this, I broke my research question down into 2 specific questions. First, I wanted to ask if there is a relationship between psychological well-being and academic performance of deaf students. Do the obstacles that these students face affect them psychologically? And can a lower psychological well-being explain lower academic performance? I also wanted to look at if there was an association between high levels of creativity and academic success. The great thing about creativity is that it can be nurtured. It develops over time. So it's a great thing for schools to invest into in order to enhance academics for students. To conduct this research, I traveled to Pune, Maharashtra to work with the Indian Red Cross School for the Deaf for about a month. And this school is very special. It primarily serves underprivileged populations. And I had 31 subjects participate in my study between the ages of 13 and 17. Because this is the ideal age that students begin to form their career aspirations and goals about their future. And I just want to take a moment right now to thank my aunt, Manisha Vaidya, who is a teacher at the school. I have a personal connection to the school and the students, and thank you so much for helping me connect with the teachers and the staff. And also, I conducted this study independent of my coursework and my lab research in neuroscience because I wanted to use tools in science to address problems in society. And I want to thank my research mentor, Swapnil Vaidya, for enabling me to do this work and for guiding me throughout from start to finish since I very first started this project. So I told you I wanted to look at these variables scientifically. So that means I needed to quantify them. And to do this, I used the PASI tests of creativity to measure creativity. And this consists of verbal and nonverbal tests. I could score the responses to these tests using a scoring manual provided by BK PASI. And I could compare the scores that the students got to an established set of norms for the Indian population. I also used a psychological well-being scale. This consisted of 50 questions. And finally, I looked at the academic records by looking at the final grade each student received at the end of their academic year, which was usually reported as a percentage, and it evaluated their performance among all of their courses. So the process of scoring creativity is a bit creative in itself. So this is a test of verbal creativity. specifically the consequences test, and I pulled up a question to show you how it works. So given the following statement, if all houses start flying, students were instructed, given a certain period of time, to come up with as many meaningful responses as possible. And you could try thinking of a few yourself right now if you're interested. Here's a couple examples. So if a student wrote accidents with others in flying houses, we would consider this to be a rather direct response, so it would get points for fluency. But a response like earthquakes harmless might be considered a bit more creative, and it would be given additional points for originality. So to summarize, the responses were scored according to their fluency and originality. This test is a little bit different. This is a nonverbal test of creativity, the blocks test. So students were given a set of toy blocks and asked to construct as many meaningful shapes and objects as possible, given a certain period of time. And a couple examples include a blackboard using the black faces of the cubes, or an arrow using a couple of different shapes. And these responses were also scored according to their fluency and originality, as I described previously, but also according to their flexibility. How many different objects could students think of? How many different categories did these objects tap into during the scoring? And we could sum the subscores of all of these tests to get a total score of creativity, and now we've quantified this variable. So to remind you of my research question, I wanted to look at psychological well-being and academic performance and see if there's some sort of relationship. And I actually found that all of the deaf students in this study had a moderate level of psychological well-being. So this actually suggests that psychological well-being can't explain lower academic performance, and we need to look elsewhere if we want to enhance the academic experience for students that are deaf, which leads us to my second research question, looking at creativity. And as I looked at this relationship between the total creativity scores and academic performance, I found a positive correlation, and this result was statistically significant. So in other words, the higher a student scored on the creativity tests, the higher their academic performance was, which hopefully suggests to schools that we should promote creativity in an educational setting. But perhaps my most striking finding was that deaf students performed much better on the nonverbal creativity tests relative to the verbal creativity tests. In fact, for the blocks test of creativity, they performed in the 95th percentile. And on all other tests, and for total creativity, they performed in the 10th, 5th, or often 0th percentile. And we can see this trend for individual scores as well. So to summarize what I found for my second research question, we found that high levels of creativity are associated with academic success, which hopefully promotes creativity academically, and also that deaf students actually outperform the nation on nonverbal blocks tests of creativity, because as again, I was comparing my results to a set of norms for the Indian population. So what does this mean, and how can we use it to improve education for students that are deaf? Because deaf students cannot develop language proficiency orally, we can recommend to schools that they should invest in the literacy of deaf students, as this is a great way for them to communicate with people who can express themselves verbally. And also because a lot of examinations and evaluations in an academic setting are verbal and require reading and writing. But at the same time, we can take advantage of this result, knowing that deaf students prefer to express themselves non-verbally by planning activities and lessons that use this nonverbal learning style and incorporate a more creative approach. And according to the most recent census data in India, there are over 21 million people that live with disabilities in India. And of these people, almost 2 million live with a hearing disability. So I hope this shows just how many people these findings can affect, and just how many people we can change in terms of their educational opportunities and life quality. And yeah, so thank you very much for listening. Thank you to everybody who supported my research, and yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Morgan Ivanoff, and I'll be talking to you about protest in India. India is often presented as having an exceptionally large number of protests. Newspapers across the globe often cover the intensity and the frequency of these events. Most of the explanations revolve around fractionalization, either fractionalized caste groups, religious groups, or other political groups. With this in mind, I wanted to know why some districts had a lot of protests while others had almost none. And what I find is that this whole idea of fractionalization and the whole idea around 1 million mutinies is actually incorrect. It is homogeneity that mattered. How do we know how many protests there are, or that there is even a variance among the different districts? To test this assumption, I use the ACLA data set. The ACLA data set uses secondary sources, like newspapers, to gather information on a number of different conflict events. I specifically studied the protest and aggregated it at the district level. I have information from 2016 to 2019, and overall end up with 694 districts. I then use this information to create a heat map. This represents not only the number of protests per the different districts, but also the variation that you see. There are actually more red districts, which represents over 120 protests than there are white districts, which represents less than 1. Overall, you can see that in India as a whole, there are an exceptionally large number of protests, as well as there is quite a few variants among the different districts. And there's no obvious pattern or regional difference to explain this. I wanted to know not only what was causing the large number of protests, but also what was causing the variance in the districts that we saw. And the popular explanations, such as religious diversity or inequality, did not explain either of these factors. To first turn to this question, I turned the most popular explanation in conflict studies and in peace building and democracy building. The first one I looked at was economic inequality. Economic inequality is often used as an explanation for the onset in conflict. It either gives people the opportunity, there are no jobs for instance, that they have the time to partake in these events, or it gives them the grievances and the motives to want to do so. I then look at religious diversity. When I first approached this question, I found that most protests and riots in India were actually examined through the Hindu-Muslim divide. Next, I looked at social capital. Social capital refers to the growth in civil society and the growth of group political power that resulted from this. Lastly, I look at trust in state. This was a proxy variable to see state legitimacy, to see if people had the grievances or the reasons to want to protest. I did not find a relationship, however, with any of those. How did I find this and test these explanations? I used the IHDS data set to do so. This survey samples over 40,000 respondents, and I use it to create measurements for these various factors like economic inequality at the district level. I then compare these districts and merge them with the ACLA data set and the districts over there that show the number of protests that we see. Overall, there are 375 districts that have both information on the protests that we see as well as the different explanatory variables. The first one I tested was economic inequality. This is a visual representation of what I found. As the districts go from beige to dark red, there's more inequality within a district. As you can see, when looking at the peaceful protests, there's no obvious visual correlation. At the inequality over here, you can see a trend of dark orange districts, so more inequality along the western side of India. Unlike that, though, the peaceful protests, you see that the dark red districts, so more protests, is generally on the top half of India. There's no obvious visual correlation. This also held true with different statistical analysis. I find similar results for all the further possible explanations. It's shown not only in the maps, but also in different simple statistical analysis. What I did find, however, is that homogeneity mattered. Districts with larger caste homogeneity actually had more protests. And districts that were more fractionalized, so there were more groups in that district, actually had less protest. And similarly, districts with 2 large caste groups and 1 small group had more protest. This graph shows that effect. On the left side, where you see number 1 for caste homogeneity, you see that there are actually the most protests. This means that there's 1 dominant group. As you move to the other side, where you see 4, so that there's more groups, so it's more fractionalized, there's the least number of protests. So there's a negative trend. And in the middle, where you see a little bump, that shows where there's 2 competing groups and 1 small group. This held even after controlling for inequality, ethnic group participation, and low trust in state. This is a visual representation of what I found. Again, this is the peaceful protest on the map, and you can see that the dark red districts are on the northern half, generally spread out among India. This is also shown in the caste homogeneity. You see a lot of the darker orange districts, so districts that are more homogeneous, are also spread out in the top half. Overall, I find that fractionalization was not correlated with the number of protests that we see or the variance in the different districts. What I find was the exact opposite. It was homogeneity. These are possible explanations that can help explain this. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Isaac Naranjo, and I'm going to be presenting on whether or not your neighborhood influences your social attitudes. So the research question that got this presentation started was whether or not the community you live in has more of an effect on an individual's social beliefs than other factors such as caste, income, or education. And this really stems from the belief that when an individual lives in a homogeneous community, they're more likely to conform to that community's standards of social beliefs. But when an individual lives in a heterogeneous community, they're more likely to be open to new ideas because there are more ideas within that community. And so what we find is that in general, this pattern holds true. When an individual lives in a dominant community, they are more likely to hold those consistent beliefs than when they live in a heterogeneous community, who are more likely to be influenced by other factors such as education, caste, and income. And another interesting finding that I found was that over a third of Indians still live in a relatively homogeneous community, which is not just a rural phenomenon. And so the way I went about discovering this is I used the 2016 youth survey, and I looked at the demographic responses within that youth survey to create 4 groups. My 4 groups were my other forward caste members, my OBCs, my SC/STs, and my Muslims. And so with those 4 groups in mind, I was able to look at the different communities or polling stations that were surveyed, and I was able to determine whether or not they were homogeneous, competing, or heterogeneous community. So what do I mean when I say homogeneous and competing and heterogeneous? When I say homogeneous, what I'm really saying is that there's a numeric preponderance of individuals within one community. So 13 out of the 15 members in one community would be OBCs. So that's an example of a homogeneous community. And when I say heterogeneous, what I'm really saying is that there's so many individuals from different kinds of groups that there's impossible to tell who lives in that community and who's dominating that community. So an example of this is to say, like, there's 4 OBCs, 2 SCs, 3 STs, and 5 Muslims. Who in that community is really dominating? It's almost impossible to tell. And so then, with these neighborhoods in mind, I was able to look at 2 questions. I looked at the question of whether or not income or caste should be the basis for reservations, or if intercaste marriage is right or wrong. And so with the first question is, we find that in India, most Indians believe that income should be a basis of reservations. And what you see is that when you live in another forward caste homogeneous community, you're more likely to believe that it should be income as a basis of reservations than when you live in an SC/ST dominant community, where you're less likely to believe that income should be the basis of reservations. And what we see is, at the end of the graph, that the heterogeneous community kind of toes the line between the other dominant communities and the SC/ST dominant communities. And so then I looked at the question of caste. And so what this graph is showing is that if I'm Isaac, another forward caste member, how does my opinion change when I live in a community that's not dominated by myself? So what this shows is that if I'm Isaac, I'm a forward caste member, and I live in an SC/ST dominant community, what that's showing is I'm less likely to believe that income should be the basis of reservations than when I'm Isaac, a forward caste member living in a forward caste dominant community. And again, what you can find is that the same pattern is holding true for SC/ST. While they're less likely, the range is lower when they're in another dominant community than a forward caste member. It's still above than when they live in a SC/ST dominant community. And the heterogeneous community is kind of this wild factor where we don't necessarily know where they're going to fall in the spectrum. And so then I looked at the question of income. So we know caste isn't necessarily breaking the pattern. How about income? And what we find is that, again, the question of income isn't necessarily breaking the pattern. So even if you're poor, rich, or middle class, the question is, when you're in a other forward caste dominant community, you're more likely to believe that it should be income that's the basis of reservations than when you're in an SC/ST dominant community. And so then I said, okay, it's not caste, it's not income, let's look at education. And what we find is that while education is having an effect on the ranges, it's not necessarily having the same effect on breaking the pattern. So again, what we find is other homogeneous or forward caste members are more likely to believe that income should be a basis of reservations more so than an SC/ST dominant community member. And another interesting fact is that once you have attained a certain level of education, the ranges no longer change. So for example, the secondary level of education looks no different than an individual who has a bachelor's or PhD. The ranges stop changing, which is a really interesting find. So then I said, okay, so we have one question, we have the patterns, it looks relatively the same. Let's look at another question. And so this question looks at whether or not intercaste marriage is right in India. And again, what we find is that the majority of Indians believe that intercaste marriage is right. And what we can see is, in this graph, is that other forward caste members are more likely to believe that intercaste marriage is right, more so than SC/ST dominant community members. And the heterogeneous community is kind of towing the line. And so when we look at the question of caste again, what we find is that this pattern is still holding true, where we don't see another homogeneous member being less likely to think that intercaste marriage is right than an SC/ST dominant community member. And so then we can look at the question of income again, and what we find is that the pattern is still being consistent, and that we're not really seeing that these questions are being broken. All we're really seeing is that there's just a change of range. And so then finally with the, with education, again, the pattern is just consistent. We can see that other forward caste dominant community members are more likely to believe that intercaste marriage is right than SC/ST dominant community members. And so in conclusion, what we find is that the community that you're living in is in a way influencing the types of effects and beliefs that you're having. More so, this is shown when you live in a dominant community, which is showing that showing that there is some level of social conformity happening in homogeneous communities. And what's interesting is, which I can't tell from this research, but would be further research that would be required, is whether or not this is some level of self-sorting. Are individuals in India choosing to live in communities that are that they see as amongst themselves, or is this some sort of subconscious or other level of another factor? Anyways, I'd just like to thank you for your time and for everyone that made this presentation possible.
Hello everyone, I'm Pranav Gupta, PhD student in political science at UC Berkeley. My presentation is on how to increase voter turnout in Indian elections. This is joint work with Rahul Verma, who's a fellow at Center for Policy Research, Delhi, and Professor Pradeep Chibber. All mistakes can be attributed to Rahul Verma, the missing co-author. So in the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, one big thing that we have observed is that there seems to be some stagnation in voter turnout. Voter turnout in most Indian states has either decreased as compared to 2014 or has just increased marginally. So something seems to be happening to voter turnout. It seems that the ECI's programs like Sweep or other voter mobilization programs, gains from these programs have now been exhausted. So what more can be done to further increase voter turnout in Indian elections? So we think of three important changes that the ECI could introduce to further increase voter turnout. And these essentially revolve around changing institutional routes. Number one, what we find is that turnout is lower at centers with multiple booths. Now what does this mean? So voting in India essentially happens in either government schools or government buildings. But the number of booths located inside a single center often varies. It goes from a single booth to as much as 8 booths in a single building. What we find is that there's a negative correlation between number of booths located inside a building and voter turnout. So the overall turnout, this is data from the UP, from Lok Sabha election 2014. This is polling station level data for about 30,000 polling stations in Uttar Pradesh. So what we find is that the average turnout in a polling booth where there's at a center where there's only a single booth is 69.6%, but the turnout drops to as low as 58.9% at centers where there are more than 3 booths. The decline is much sharper for female turnout. Secondly, we believe that that turnout could be further increased if the size of every booth is reduced. So the number of electors registered to vote in a single booth varies across the state. This is data for about 130,000 polling stations in Uttar Pradesh again. And what we find is that the number of electors registered to vote varies from as low as 500 or 600 to as much as 1,500. And there's a clear negative correlation between voter turnout and size of the booth. Thirdly, we believe that one major reason for low turnout estimate in the country is that we are estimating turnout wrongly. The denominator that we have for estimating turnout, that is the number of electors, seems to be inflated. Now, there are two big reasons for this. One, a lot of migrants or people who have shifted out are still registered on the electoral rolls. Their names are not deleted by the BLOs. And secondly, for people, even after they die, their names are not deleted from the electoral rolls. So we did two studies across, two different studies to look at this. So one, we tied up with the district administration in Banda in Uttar Pradesh for the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, where the district administration launched a program for increasing turnout to beyond 90%. So the mission 90% turnout. So what we did a census survey across the district trying to estimate the number of migrants or people who have shifted out to other cities or even shifted out within the district who are registered in each polling booth. Surprisingly, what we find is that around 10 to 15% on an average, electors registered in a booth don't even stay there. And in that case, as you can see, that the ECI estimate of the turnout is 63.1% for Banda. Even if the BLOs manage to delete about 25% migrants, turnout would increase to 64.8%. And if all migrants, people who don't stay there, are deleted from the electoral rolls, we would have a turnout of 70.3%. And this deletion is part of the job of BLO. So every year, electoral rolls are revised. They're supposed to go house to house and update the electoral rolls. In Odisha, what we find surprisingly is that the number of electors in Odisha is higher than the projected population based on the census. Now, of course, we know that the census figures are not exactly accurate, but we do find that, especially among the middle-age cohorts, is as much as 1.21, which means that the ratio between the electors on the voter list and the population is 1.21. And this has one big major impact on political participation in India. So in recent years, one big story is that there has been a contraction of gender gap. Now, if a lot of migrants are still on the electoral rolls, and these are people who are not turning out to vote, then what seems to be happening is that we are highly underestimating male turnout. And if that is the case, then this big story coming from the Bimaru state, that the gender gap in voter turnout does not exist anymore, questions can be raised on this big story. So third big thing that we believe is that something needs to be done on updating electoral rolls properly. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Barbara, and for my research project, I created an ideological ranking of members of parliament. So currently there is no ideological ranking of politicians in India, and this is because members of parliament almost always vote with their party, so it's really hard to differentiate between them on the basis of ideology. However, with the expansion of Twitter, and especially after the 2014 elections, members of parliament have been getting on Twitter, they've been using it to express themselves and reach out to constituents, and so they've really built a personalized online presence. And so my idea was to take this personalized online presence, and because it is personalized, use it to differentiate between different members of parliament. So in order to do this, I used 380,000 tweets from 161 MPs. The data was collected in February of 2018. I then cleaned the data to make it more processable. I create a dictionary that takes the words that appear most frequently across all of the tweets. And then I create a training set. So for example, I assign to Yogi Adityanath the score of 0.1, or most right-wing, and then I assign to Shashi Tharoor the score of 0.9, or most left-wing. And using these baselines, I then look at all the other tweets, and I look at how similar they are to tweets by Yogi Adityanath or Shashi Tharoor, and I assign them an ideological score. And so then I train my model using a single layer neural net, and then I classify all of the remaining tweets. So I tried a couple different classification methods. I tried changing how I build the dictionary. So I tried using TF-IDF, I tried making it longer or shorter, I tried including groups of 2 words or groups of 3 words instead of just individual words. But what I found is that because of the nature of my data, which is pretty short tweets, the simplest model that includes all the data ended up being the one that works best. So that's the single layer neural net. So the results I find is that first of all, my model is really good at differentiating between BJP MPs and Congress MPs, as you can see from this graph. And then in this graph, since I'm grouping all regional parties together, we can't really tell if it's differentiating well or not. But I also wanted to point out that my model performs better for BJP MPs. It gives them a wider spread, and it gives them more consistent results because there are a lot more BJP MPs represented in my data. For Congress MPs, there were only 8 in my data, and so the spread is a little wider and the results were a little bit less consistent. I then wanted to highlight some scores for some MPs you might recognize, and particularly I wanted to highlight how these scores follow how we typically think of these MPs. So for example, VK Singh and Sushma Swaraj are typically seen as less conservative members of the BJP, and they're getting scores that are less conservative. So overall, 82% of the BJP handles were classified as right-wing, 88% of the Congress handles were classified as left-wing, and the most left-wing score for a BJP MP was by Kirti Azad, who actually left the BJP and joined Congress. So I took this as confirmation that my model was performing well. So then the next step was to see if the ideological scores for MPs actually correlate to the ideological scores for the constituencies they represent, or if those are completely independent. So to do this, I used data from the National Election Study Survey in 2014, and I saw that the correlation was about 30%. So overall, MPs' ideological scores is pretty similar to the scores for the constituencies they represent, but as you can see from this graph, there are a couple of outliers where the scores do not match up at all. So again, I wanted to emphasize that this data is only representative of 161 MPs. So ideally in the future, I would expand this to include tweets from all MPs who have a Twitter and from a wider time range. I also have the problem that my data doesn't include a lot of data for smaller parties because of the composition of the Lok Sabha. By nature, my model will always perform better for BJP MPs because there is more data to use and there are more MPs to classify. But overall, I think this ideological scale gives us a great new avenue of research to look at MPs' individual ideology, how it correlates to their online presence, how it correlates to the ideological scores of their constituencies, and many other research questions that we can answer using this ideological ranking. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I promised the last presentation, so please bear with me. My research is focused on a question that is under much discussion right now, which is how Vidhan Sabha elections affect general election outcomes in India. So my specific research question is, do Vidhan Sabha results influence Lok Sabha elections held within a short span of time? So some discourse on the topic suggests that when Vidhan Sabha elections are held within a short span of time, they do have some spillover effect. Some research done on the topic has suggested that there is barely any spillover effect, but this research includes all states and all election years. What I personally find is Vidhan Sabha elections can marginally influence the results of Lok Sabha elections, but this holds true only in two-party states. And national parties can get a positive spillover during Lok Sabha elections. However, this spillover effect benefited the Congress until 1991, and the BJP is a primary beneficiary of this spillover post-1996. And 2019, in fact, demonstrated the degree of this shift that I will hopefully demonstrate, has been a long time coming. So the data used for this project was aggregate election data from the portal Loktaba, as well as some delimitation data from Francesca Jensenis, who is a professor at University of Oslo.
And a Berkeley PhD.
And a Berkeley PhD. So why would we expect divergent patterns of predictability? So firstly, one thing that's really important to understand is the average margin of victory in two-party states is quite a bit larger than the average margin of victory in multi-party states. So multi-party states are extremely volatile because if a party wins an assembly election with a large margin of victory, it is obviously difficult for the losing party to overcome that margin and win in a subsequent general election. So that's one reason why we could expect divergent patterns, and parties with a stronger national image can be expected to have larger spillover effects in general. So I considered 8 core states, and the data covers a period of 49 years. I picked the years I only picked years where the Vidhan Sabha election preceded the Lok Sabha election by 1 or 2 years, since time has shown to be a factor that influences the degree of the spillover effect. So what I basically did was I looked at the fraction of assembly segments in a state election at time t that have the same winning party as the larger Lok Sabha seat. So the Lok Sabha seat that includes that assembly segment in time t plus 1. So a higher fraction would suggest larger alignment between state elections and Lok Sabha elections. So what do I find for two-party states? So basically Gujarat, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, you see a steady increase in this fraction. So as you can see, in 1991, barely 40% of Vidhan Sabha seats had the same winning party as the larger Lok Sabha seat in which they were situated. And this number has increased and reached upwards of 70% in 2014, which suggests that there was very high alignment in 2014 between the Vidhan Sabha and Lok Sabha results. And the exact inverse is seen in multi-party states. So UP is the most stark example of this, where you see it started off at the same level as the two-party states, around 40%, and it's declined to below 20%. So less than 20% in 2014, less than 20% of the Vidhan Sabha seats had the same winning party as their larger Lok Sabha seat in 2014. So this basically tells us that the margin of victory in multi-party states is just too small, it's too volatile to make any good predictions. And assembly elections do not directly inform Lok Sabha elections in two-party states. However, they can give some indication of the shift of sentiment that is occurring. And pre-2014 Vidhan Sabha results, particularly in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, could have easily been used to foreshadow the dominant BJP outcome in these states. Now, I know the question that is on everyone's mind right now is what happened day before yesterday, and why was there close to zero spillover effect from closely held assembly elections in two-party states in 2019, and hopefully I have some answers for you. Incorporating the results from day before yesterday, so there was a dip in the fraction of, again, assembly segments that had the same winning party as the larger Lok Sabha seat. However, the dip doesn't nearly, the fraction and the number is similar to what it was in 1991, and it's not nearly as low as it is for multi-party states. So despite the fact that, yes, in these elections there was quite a bit less alignment, it's still not as bad as in multi-party states where elections are just too volatile. And this does hold and suggest that there is a divergence of the two types of states in India that we're seeing. But obviously there's something else at play. Like, why did we see such a large dip? And I think the other factor that basically influences the degree of spillover effect is the party itself. So I analyzed the difference of the spillover effect between the Congress and BJP over the years. And the next series of graphs will basically depict the vote share of a party in an assembly segment and the vote share of the same party in the encompassing Lok Sabha seat in the subsequent general election. So you get a scatter plot, and the slope basically tells you the degree of the spillover effect. So a steeper slope means that higher vote shares in assembly segments did lead to higher vote shares in Lok Sabha segments in subsequent elections. Now, this is the graphs for the Congress, so you can pretty clearly see that pre-1996 the slope was pretty steep, and it's come down quite a bit if you look at the post-1996 data. And if you incorporate the 2019 data, it's projected to come down even further. And that line flattening out basically shows how Congress is receiving less and less of a spillover effect as time goes on. And the exact opposite effect is seen for BJP, where you see before 1996 the line was almost flat, which shows that the increases in assembly segment vote shares did not translate into spillover effects. And there's a very sharp increase that shows how far the Congress has come in terms of its taking up the space as the national party in power. And this pretty much encapsulates the effect we've seen in the last couple of decades, where the pre-1996 Congress slope is pretty much identical to the post-1996 BJP slope. So BJP today is receiving the same spillover effect that Congress did before 1996, which is just a pretty stark result. And we can look at what happened in 2019, and these are the graphs from Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan. So again, the x-axis shows the assembly segment vote share in a particular assembly segment in 2018 assembly elections, and the y-axis shows the vote share in the 2019 elections of the larger Lok Sabha seat. The line is a little upward sloping, so Congress performed in the same level as it did in 2014 in the two-party states, and as far as vote share goes at least. In Rajasthan, there was a marginal increase in vote share, but that didn't translate into any seat wins. But you can clearly see just how flat the line is compared to the pre-1996 Congress days. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what side of the camp you're on, it's pretty clear that this shows the degree to which Congress has lost its national image. So yes, to encapsulate all the results, so BJP currently receives a much higher bump than the Congress. So if BJP wins the state election, they are likely to carry those spillover effects to the subsequent general election, whereas for Congress it doesn't hold as true. The BJP's national emergence is reminiscent of the pre-96 Congress days. And in fact, even if you look at the assembly seats in 2018 that BJP won in these two-party states, they won the larger Lok Sabha seat with an even higher margin and even higher vote share. So Congress victories in the two-party states did not translate in Lok Sabha wins. The spillover effect was close to nil, again suggesting the extent to which it lost its national image, and also showing that day before yesterday's results were more a natural progression of that slope just going down, and not something out of the blue, which shows that the decline has been a long time coming. Thank you. And, my bad. Possible avenues of further research. The first question is important for Congress to answer, which is, what can parties do to influence the spillover effects? Are there particular decisions that parties take that may manifest in larger spillover effects? And it'll be interesting to see how regional parties differ with their own spillover effects. Thank you.
Okay, and for those of you who care to know, the results came out day before yesterday, and he has included them all in his analysis already. So it's amazing. So thank you, Anish. Okay, so I'm going to ask the discussants to speak for a few minutes, and I'm sure they'll have exciting things to say, and they'll answer all kinds of things. And then we'll open up the floor for discussion. The students can take notes, and I'll expect them to respond at the end of the questions from the audience. So, Yamini, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, I have to say, I thought this would be an afternoon spent sort of pontificating, but actually I think I have learned a lot more from the last hour than I had anticipated. This is truly, really fantastic. And it underscores for me one of the most central challenges that we have as observers, students, and commentators on what's happening in contemporary India. How little we actually know of the deep transitions and shifts that are taking place. How limited we are in terms of the kinds of data sets that we have available to us to start unpacking this. And what a substantial contribution you all are making to enabling us and empowering us to begin thinking about some of the big questions. So what I thought I'll do in the couple of minutes that I have is try to sort of step back from the nitty-gritties of the presentations, each of which I must say are truly fantastic and throw up very, very important sets of questions, and see what are the big sort of frameworks that we need to start building on to be able to draw on these data sets and the analysis that you have presented to further our understanding of what's actually happening. And I think, of course, one central issue to me is about how citizens and state institutions relate to one another. And if you look across the range of your presentations, the question of trust, and I think interspersed within that question of trust is how local and national level political parties and politicians are negotiating and mediating that relationship of trust. And there's a third actor here, which I think the presentation on credit, formal credit touched on briefly, which is the local administrator. So citizens see the state in different ways because their relationships with the state seem to be mediated through a range of institutions and through different kinds of actors. And each one of these institutions are also going through their own processes of transition. It's quite fascinating if you think of the last presentation. Until about 2014, when you saw a fair amount of regional variation between state political parties at the states versus political party at the center, one important question was, how do state actors take central schemes, reorient them, rename them, and take credit for them? And the reason why National Rural Employment Guarantee is now Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee was precisely because BJP states were taking them and making them their own, and the Congress was left scratching their heads. Now you see, so as you see more alignment, there is a shift that is taking place in how state politicians and state governments are looking at national schemes and national programs, and that and how that then affects the ways in which citizens are beginning to engage or think about the state, their experiences with the state, and what that does then to further shape their understandings of state, their idea of trust. And ultimately, I think the kind of political outcomes that you see are very much going to be about the way that narrative of trust articulates itself in the form of voting behavior. So I think one of the important things that I would urge you to do is to take different parts of what you've looked at and try and place them together to piece that puzzle about how the average voter relates to the state, and how the relationship of claim making, mediation, and engagement with the state is changing, and what impact that's going to have on voting behavior. I don't think that we have a grasp of it enough right now. As somebody, for example, who follows welfare programs very closely, I find it difficult to fully believe that a lot of what has happened in these in the interpretation of 2019, that the implementation of schemes that actually touch people's lives, shape people's voting behavior, because I do think that there are significant gaps in the way that implementation has happened. But I do think that the central difference between what happened between 2014 and 2019 and in years previous is the way in which the party structures mediated the actual implementation of these schemes. And that, I think, really changes how voters perceive governments at the center and state, how voters perceive their relationships with local institutions, and how the relationship of trust gets built and final outcomes when they go to the polling booths. I also think that the presentation on both in terms of what does and doesn't shape social attitudes, how we organize ourselves socially, are very, very important questions, again, for which we don't have the right kind of frameworks. Every known about Indian society is, I think, going through a fundamental transition. And we just don't know what are the new ways in which we can start interpreting what we are seeing on the ground. So there are assumptions. How is it that a more literate population, a more reading population is now shaping its attitudes? We do ask ourselves a lot of questions about the roles of the internet, of social media, of WhatsApp in shaping the way people think. And yet when you start diving into it, we are getting something completely different. How people organize themselves, how people live. One issue that is completely missing from all the presentations that I would really urge you to pick up and look at much, much more carefully, how is internal migration shaping how people how people are living in urban contexts, but most importantly, how people are living in those smaller towns that are slowly morphing from rural to urban, and how movement in and out of these census towns is shaping the way in which communities are organizing and reorganizing themselves, and what final impact that's going to have on this renegotiation of social attitudes and social perspectives. So I think, to my mind, what I would like to learn a lot more from as you dive further into these data sets is this question of how social attitudes are being shaped, looking particularly at shifts in movement and mobility of people, looking particularly at how those shifts in movement and mobility are shaping organization of how people live, and what that is then doing to attitudes. Because I do think that there's something that's going to be quite remarkable there. It is quite stunning to me that a lot of Bihar is now sitting in Tamil Nadu. A lot of Bihar is sitting sitting in Tamil Nadu with small children that have no schools to go to because Tamil Nadu's government elementary schools are teaching in Tamil. What is that doing to these young, to the education of these young boys and girls? What is that doing to shaping their understandings of regionalism and regional identity is also, I think, going to be a very central question to how India shapes itself over the next 10 to 20 years. I thought that the presentation on language was particularly interesting, also because there is, so I do a bunch of work on elementary education, and there's a very live debate right now on the question of teaching in the mother tongue. Government schools are largely run in local languages, and increasingly
one of the reasons for the transition to private schools, along with the fact that government schools are not necessarily delivering what parents want, is English. What's happening also as a consequence is, at least in the elementary school level, you are ending up with the poorest of children in government schools, and anyone who has means is moving into private schools. So to me, as I was looking at your data, one question that struck me was, are we in some senses outsourcing democracy to India's poorest? We know the sort of big question. Elites have completely, in more ways than one, exited from the public system, and a big sort of the big picture question is how does that then affect the ability to hold the state accountable for the basic public services and delivery of public goods to citizens, and increasingly now you're seeing that happen across segments of elites across the country. So if it is true that those who are studying in regional languages are also the most engaged in local political activity, and if there is a significant income differential between those who are going, at least at the elementary level, who are going to government schools versus those who are going to private schools, it is a question that's worth that I think is worth a little more further investigation. So thanks. This has been a lot of food for thought, and I hope to learn more from your work going forward.
Thank you. As Yamini said, India is going through a tremendous amount of churn. And I remember the article 2 days ago in the Hindu by Faisal Devji, if you read it. So many, and what you say, many of you said today really showed that it is happening, that all our old ideas or stereotypes may not longer be true anymore. Especially when I saw the piece on the protests, or the one on your social attitudes. You can see how things are different. Things are not the simple solutions we always look for. And therefore, in that situation, to capture what is actually happening, because whatever you do is either out of date or it's a snapshot which it doesn't really represent. So it is becoming increasingly more difficult now to speak with the amount of certitude about what is happening. The credibility of the state is obviously very, very important. But here again, the paradox runs. Enough studies have shown that the poorer you are, the more faith you have in the system on one hand. You have shown that thanks to regional identity, regional medium of instruction and therefore identity, that helps you have greater faith in the system, because the system has now given you space, given you agency. And therefore, on the other hand, again, the elite have not simply exited. In many ways, as Rakesh Mo, the economist, told me many years ago, they seceded from the country. Where you have your own water supply, your own electricity, your own security, your own education system and your own health care. In effect, you have seceded. And therefore, the faith in the system that they have, so the guys who attack the government say it is irrelevant, government sleeps. Precisely the guys who don't need the government, who are working outside the government framework, while others who really need the government are the ones which have delivery issues. And delivery is an issue. So therefore, but the solution again is, I would credit, in fact, a lot of the UP 217 results at the margin, not overall, but at the margin, to the efficient delivery of Ujjwala. Suddenly getting gas, cooking gas in the home, which for us is the most normal thing. But for somebody living in a very small hut and she's inhaling smoke and her daughter is inhaling smoke and a pregnant child is, I think it is and the hours spent in collecting biomass. So obviously delivery does matter. People do notice it. While there may not be a 1:1 equation with immediate voting, I think it does help change their attitude towards the state and towards the system that is in place. Because we are, in any case, complex, we are diverse, and we are in churn, samples to me is an issue. So while I'm very impressed with the ability to read 550 or whatever editorials in 11 languages, or the Twitter, the hundreds of thousands of Twitter, this thing, whether these are actually good samples, I am not too sure. The hard work is very appreciated. Not taking names, but taking name. Kirti Azad was attacking the government only because he had to fight with Delhi cricket. There was no other issue involved, So exactly. His fight was with Arun Jaitley. So nothing to do with ideology in that sense, So therefore, people take positions. Shashi Tharoor comes out as very liberal, right? The most liberal, the most left-wing. What was his attitude on Sabrimala? So, nothing is very simple, unfortunately. It does give problems of... so I'm really impressed with the effort you put in. But I think as you look more and more into it, you'll find there's a greater nuancing. And yes, thank God somebody who did work on the deaf, the special needs children, etc. Learning outcomes is a very, very serious issue in the country. If you look at all the ASAR reports and non-ASAR, even the government reports, it is definitely a very, very learning issue. And then how to provide for those children with special needs and integrate them into the normal schools. At the end of the day, they have to live with society. They can't be cocooned from society. And therefore, how best to do that is again something which is very, very something. But again, I will not say too much long because we really want to hear you, want to hear Shekhar, is the fact that I think for people who have done it such a short period of time, I think the sheer amount of work put in and the quality of work put in and the kind of thinking which went into it, I think it's something we really must appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pradeep, academics have the power to ban certain words in their for their students. So I remember that Steve Cohen had banned for us superpower and third world because he said once you use any of these expressions, you close your mind because then the rest of the analysis follows like that. So editors can also ban certain words in our newsrooms. So there are two that when you come to an academic event, you expect to hear that we ban in our newsrooms. One is narrative and one is discourse. And I tell you the third that we would love to ban but we can't. That's data. Because journalists don't like data. Because data takes too long. Data is painstaking. Somebody can check your data. Journalists go and sniff the air and talk to the driver and talk to a couple of dhabawalas and then pick up the sense. And then when we meet each other, they ask each other, so what's the sense? And by the evening, a consensus is arrived at. And so we find it very challenged when we look at data. That's why we should come to places like this to understand and to see what an impressive body of work all of you have put in a short time. I'm not saying all of you young people because anybody who's an adult is an adult. So there are many interesting takeaways here and many questions. I think the basic definition of who's liberal and who's conservative in India has to be different from what it might be in Europe or America. Because India has other complexities and India has its own definitions. Shakti took my line about Shashi Tharoor, who you might find liberal or left because he's in the Congress. But on Sabrimala, he was as right as the BJP, but not just that. Even on the economy, he will be more right. He'll be as right as the old Congress right that Nehru purged in the early 60s. Which then became Swatantra Party. So I think just the reading of Twitter or newspaper editorials can be a little dodgy. Also, people are hypocrites. People don't exactly bare their hearts in what they put out in public. So that's one. So you can't say left or right in India like that. Yogi Adityanath, I bet he doesn't even read what goes out on his Twitter. It is some flunky in his office who does it, and similarly on editorials, I'm talking first about issues that I might know a bit more closely. I can tell you this, that in Indian newspapers, did you read only editorials or columns as well? Yeah. So editorials, if I can let out a dirty in-house secret that, barring a paper like, say, the Hindu, maybe the odd other, I don't think editors, and I don't think anybody takes editorials so seriously as to focus on them. You just want to make sure that there are no typos left there, right? So I think trying to figure out a paper's bias from editorials through editorials is a bit dodgy. I would do the next project now, looking at how they cover some key stories. For example, take up any 50 big stories of the year and see how each one covers it. So that's one. The other thing is, I'm not surprised that people are not impressed with bias, because people know. Particularly TV, and I'm not at all surprised that TV doesn't influence anybody, because news TV in India is now entertainment, right? So you watch what you believe in, you watch what you agree with, you watch based on what your biases are, and then you say, fantastic. So your mind can't be changed watching TV, because, if you watch TV and your mind is, and what is being said you don't like, then you say, this guy is sold, right? This guy is a communist, he's an urban Naxal, he's a Bhakt, he's this and that. So I think it's very similar now to what's happening in democracies around the world. I find some other very interesting things. It's regional language and greater faith in the state and greater political participation. I think this is very interesting, fascinating, but it requires the next level. You have to go one level below this surface. Is it because of the kind of textbooks and curriculum that regional languages are teaching? Is it teaching students to be more questioning or less questioning? English, the medium of the school where you go to, also determines or is determined by your family's economic status. So if you are a bit richer or a bit well-to-do relative to others, are you then automatically less likely to be politically active? Are you less likely to have time because you are preparing for your IITs and for other exams, or to go out of the village or the city to do other things? So I think this is a fascinating takeaway, but I think we should look at other aspects, because there is no way, no matter what the government does, more and more young people will now go to English medium schools in any part of the country. So that is a given. Again, very fascinating, access to state-sponsored credit, that people trust the state more when they borrow from a state credit agency. Fascinating, but very logical, because, you will trust the police only after somebody has burgled your house and maybe cops have caught the man. So most local level credit, most informal credit in India is thuggery. So it's only after you've been charged exorbitant interest rates by somebody, or somebody has harassed you, that you start thinking, oh, maybe the bank is better, or maybe my cooperative is better. So again, very logical, but a very good takeaway. The study on learning outcomes among deaf students, yours? Yeah, in fact, I'd like, if you can send me a copy of that, but I'd like to understand this a bit better. Economic equality, Hindu-Muslim divide, social capital, trust in state. Again, India, normally you would think that as India urbanizes, people move into cities, India will become more heterogeneous. at the first stage, this is correct. But at the second stage of economic and social development, it changes. Because then Delhi is not the best example because Delhi doesn't have an apartment culture. But then in the richer cities with apartment culture, people tend to flock together. So, I mean, a city like Bombay, for example, there'll be Jain buildings where nobody can have anything non-vegetarian. There'll be Gujarati buildings. There'll be Muslim buildings, etc. So, urbanization doesn't necessarily promise heterogeneity unless you plan for it, which India has never done because most urbanization in India happens illegally. In this city, legally you can build no more than 3.5 floors, but illegally you can build 8 floors, 10 floors. You can just go around all our authorized colonies and unauthorized ones go higher. So those are complications in India. The issue of voters lists. Now, voters lists, women, now this is something that Pranay's book has also now brought out. And there are arguments for and against this. For example, there are arguments also on the extrapolation of the 2011 census data to say this is what the voter number should be and the percentage of women should have increased to this much, but we don't know whether it has increased or not. In fact, that is the Election Commission's argument as well. So that is something worth looking at. Rest, I would say that BJP becoming what Congress used to be pre-96, BJP is the new Congress. See, until 91, not 96, until 91, Indian politics, the tragedy of Indian politics has been, it's always had a single one pole. So until 91, it was the Congress. Now, increasingly, it's only the BJP. So India never really built a left-right, a genuine left-right, liberal-conservative binary in its politics, which at one level gives stability to India, but at another level, it just makes our politics much too boring. I mean, we get entertainment from other aspects of politics, but the ideological differentiation in our politics is not that much. I mean, ideological difference can't be will you beat up on the Muslims or will you not beat up on the Muslims. It has to be something wider, which is missing in Indian politics. So once again, you make that point very, very soundly.
I forgot to say one thing on the election and voter list. I actually benefited from the failures of the local booth level officer who should have struck me off the electoral roll 3 years ago and still hasn't. So I have voted on a false address. Actually, after having come and verified me, he gave me a false address. So now I have voted 4 times on a false address, but I still managed to do it this time.
He shall report you.
But I think there's a larger point. I think, when it comes to any debate that we have on the Indian state, we inevitably talk about the failures of the Indian state and its limited capacity, and that's a sort of big overarching challenge. But every debate on the Indian state and state capacity will always pull you to that one trope we pull out, that when it comes to those singular things, single goals, easy to achieve, mobilize the entire state, the Indian state manages, look at how we get our elections done. I think it's very important to start poking holes in that narrative because the fact is that not only has the Indian state proved to be thoroughly incompetent when it comes to complicated tasks, whether it's regulation or getting children to learn in schools, in its everyday, very basic set of things, it fails miserably, and we shouldn't let it go. We should pursue this, and we shouldn't allow these old narratives to continue as we talk about the state.
That the Kumbh Mela syndrome, that anytime you say government of India doesn't work, they see we hold the Kumbh Mela with 10 million people and nothing happens.
One more sentence in the same trend. On urban homogeneity, why people live together, one is the big complex, apartment complex. In slums, and I've worked with a lot of NGOs there, one person comes from a small village, he brings his cousin over, brings other relatives over, and obviously they live and huddle together, they keep going up and down. The natural tendency to homogenize in the city, So that is something which, as a safety man.
My name is C.K. Jain. I'm a Berkeley alumnus. I have a question for Shekhar first. Do the editors write the editorials, or do they simply make the typo corrections in the owner's editorials? All right. The question for Janani. I do not accept your hypothesis that newspapers make more impact than the TV. I think there could be a fault in the data. Perhaps you have neglected taking into account the educational level of the sample. I guess that would make an entire lot of difference. Not so many people read the newspapers, but I guess everybody watches the TV now. So that has to be taken into account. Perhaps that is the flaw in your.
I know data is our common enemy. Damages are really, but newspaper readership is going up higher than TV viewership. English TV viewership is so little that I'd rather not mention.
So, with regards to education,
You don't have to react just now. Let's take help.
But let's have the answer from Shekhar.
You will get the answer, but let's hear all the questions. You have to ask these.
I feel that the study on the deaf children that you did, it is a remarkable one. But what surprises me is that in Indian schools, especially the government ones and also the private ones, you do find that there continues to be insensitivity of the peers, of the teachers, and as a result of which the academic excellence or academic performance that we talk about, it does get impeded. During the 23 and a half years of my service in NCERT, I used to go to the fields in every UT states, and to my shock, I found that each time we raised the questions about the facilities to these children, we found these state officials defending themselves all the time, except in two. When in Port Blair, where Shakti Sinha was the chief secretary, there was a child with cerebral palsy, and he had lost his mother, who used to bring the child to school every day. And the teacher was very sensitive, and he told us the story of this child. We went to the house. We found that he was the son of a poor farmer. And when coming back to NCERT, I wrote a letter to the chief secretary. It wasn't just taken as a letter. It was followed up, and I received a reply to that letter from Port Blair, saying that the child would have a person to take him to the school every day, and also provided an amount of 2,000 rupees every month. I'm sure this child, who loved going to the school, would be able to learn something because of the sensitivity of the teacher and also the sensitive administration. The second example was Punjab, but then it pains me to see that most of the children who are challenged in physically or in even learning disability is a great, huge issue with many of the children. But what one needs to now try and do is to create some kind of sensitivity first, and ensure that the programs which are meant for these children, the facilities which are meant for these children, they are actually reaching them. Otherwise, feeling very happy that they are there, the ramps are there, everything is there, but when the child cannot get on the ramp himself or herself, who is there to help the child? Most of the teachers, one has found out in the fields, that they try to defend themselves. So does the administration. So I feel that having the facilities, these schemes for so long, and having so less a number of children benefiting from them is a very painful, fact which is difficult to digest. If a study could be done and a blueprint be created, which many of the states have, but then how it gets implemented. Internalization is there to some extent, but the gap between the internalization and the implementation has gone on for years and for years. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? Keep it short. Yes, sir. I'm not a politician. I'm an industry executive coming from automobile industry. In industry, we have a definite accountability. You have to produce 500 trucks or 500 two-wheelers in a month. It has to be 500 plus minus 3%. As far as business of politics is concerned, I think we have spent about 50, 70 years after independence. No system of accountability for politicians anybody has tried to think of and try to implement. I think this is the question with all the researchers. Research work is, I know, mainly very seriously being done in US. In India, it has to take a lot of time to take shape. Now, what way we can try to fix up accountability for the politicians? My feeling is manifesto. When a party comes up with a manifesto on the first hand, there should be a particular society.
Sir, do you have a question? Because we need for the students.
Yeah.
They have made their 9 presentations. Within that, would like to ask them a question.
So, my question is not the presentation. It's a different.
So can you focus on accountability?
We can do it offline. We can do it offline.
Sir. Thank you. Yes, sir. For the students, anybody any questions?
Sir, can you just tell me what is the future of independence of media, whether it's going to be sponsored or owned by people like business community or politician, how we can protect our independence of media?
So I don't think it's fair for me to answer questions. Questions should be directed to students.
So I just want to congratulate all of the speakers. I have 2 very quick questions for 2.
David is also a Berkeley student who is now a grad student at Yale, for those of you who care to know.
I'll be very, very quick. I'll keep them short. For Anish, my question is just, so you look at aggregating up what the state election results mirror the Lok Sabha election as well. Do you expect the relationship to go the other way as well? Do you think, just your best guess on whether Lok Sabha election results might affect state election results that happen soon after the election, so if there's a result you
In fact, Chief is not going to the same.
I didn't mean to cut you off. And then, very quickly for Morgan, you've heard a lot of, insight on how your results may not be as counterintuitive as you think, but what's your best guess on why the relationship that you told us about is
are now made public would really affect your data set and give a more conservative rankings to the papers who are more left and just writing those editorials because they are now made important because of conservative.
Okay, one more question, then I'll get to respond to. I'll just make a small statement. Yes, sir. One question.
I have a question for Ironman. It's a very fascinating study, but I was wondering if you've looked at the effects of the kind of education that a student gets on their political attitudes. I was thinking in terms of liberal arts versus science education, because clearly their attitudes seem to be qualitatively different. So that would be one sort of dimension you might be interested in looking at.
See, contemporary India. Do you have a question for the students? So I'm telling you, the topic is contemporary India. Contemporary India is not only about elections and politics. None of them covered it.
May I have, let the students can respond to this.
I'll be really quick with the effects. So we had a presentation last time analyzing that same effect, and there was basically no major causal effect on the election to the outcomes. So it seems like people are placing their minds on what is the state in the time before the Lok Sabha. Yeah, so there's basically no major causal effect from general election results to Vidhan Sabha results. Like the honeymoon period is not as significant as people may think. So definitely what state parties are doing at the local level is making people decide their minds based on future Lok Sabha results. And the personality question, I'll definitely look at that into a little more detail. I'm sure it plays an effect on spillover effects, and they're kind of reflected by the personalities you see in Congress and BJP before 1996 and after. So I'm sure that plays an effect.
Anybody else want to respond? Yes, Mom.
So I think one of the cool things about this class is that our projects do overlap a little bit, and Isaac actually did show that urban areas were just as homogeneous. So that was something that was well taken into account, and it did help form some of my ideas of why what I was seeing. And I thought about it more as a collective action problem, as most protests are. If you're going to go to a protest, you would actually rather not act and still get the collective good, because you wouldn't want to take the risk of getting arrested or any harm or anything like that. So for me, I thought in homogeneous districts that you would actually be able to monitor each other and overcome this free rider problem. So I thought of it more as a collective action problem rather than it was well taken into account that everybody is homogeneous.
Yeah, I had a few comments to respond to. So first, there was one about key education levels and how key bias should have had a larger effect, presumably, than newspaper bias. So, I mean, I went in with very little assumptions, besides the fact that I expected to see that media bias would have some sort of larger effect than, on a large effect on attitudes. That said, after looking over my data, while there might be some tweaks I could make to the TV bias rating scale, we do see that TV bias is not having an effect across different education levels. I did look at the different education levels and across all of them, so it's broken down by people who graduated primary education, middle school, secondary education, BAs, PhDs, and across all of those levels, TV bias is not having an effect, whereas newspaper bias would be having statistically significant association on that. Do you have a follow-up? Okay.
Literate and illiterate, educated and uneducated, not the education level as such.
Oh, okay, the ability to read versus not. That is true. There wouldn't necessarily be a direct question on this in the survey. However, we could take the people who have an education less than, let's say, a few years at elementary school, who never graduated elementary school. We could dump them perhaps maybe in an illiterate group, and even in that group we were seeing that TV bias did not have an effect. So perhaps that could be a correlation there, but I'd have to look into that more. And then someone raised the issue of independence of the media. I don't remember who was talking about that, but I think it is a very interesting question to raise about how we address independence of media in India, or in any country actually, because a lot of the Indian media is owned by people who are directly related to politicians, especially TV channels. We see this all the time. Someone's sister is a Congress Party MP, or someone's husband is a BJP party MP. It's just there's a lot of ties here, so I don't think there's necessarily a good way to do it besides maybe government regulations saying there has to be some sort of unbiased person overseeing media, some third party overseeing who can own media, or at least a disclaimer given by media channels if they do have these connections to parties. But I don't see there's being a very easy way, unfortunately, to fix this current problem. And then the third question was provided over here. about how left newspapers have to respond to topics that more conservative newspapers are raising, and whether this will cause left newspapers to be rated as more conservative. Well, I think that might be true. There's a lot of these issues that have been raised by conservative newspapers. We are seeing that left newspapers respond in a leftist way to it. I don't really, maybe more liberal way is the better term to use there. So, even if you're talking about an issue like the Ayodhya temple dispute, which I'm guessing is very much raised by the conservative media, editorials will espouse a very liberal viewpoint on it when responding, and then and if they didn't say something extremely liberal, even if they were neutral, then it would be rated as a 0, so it shouldn't bias it too much towards a conservative scale. So I really wouldn't worry about that as being as a biasing factor on my rating.
So primarily, when I was trying to account for the difference made by the medium of instruction, I was just looking at it in terms of the environment created by a public school as opposed to the environment which is more open, created by a private school. So yeah, I agree that it'd be pretty interesting to see what impact one's curriculum actually has as opposed to the environment on their political perspectives.
So thank you very much. There's a brief reception outside, so please join us.
Can I make a small announcement, please? We have a University of California alumni in India